Hi, my name is Ellen Matloff. I'm a genetic counselor, and I worked at Yale School of Medicine as the founder and the director of that program for 18 years before starting my own company called My Gene Council, where I'm a co-founder and CEO.
So you have so many accomplishments under your belt, but one that I think is especially important for Breasties to know, because so many of us have been impacted by this, but the BRCA 1 and 2 patent case that you saw through for nearly 20 years. Can you give me like a quick overview of what that was?
Sure. When I came to Yale at age 26 to start a program and moved to Connecticut to do so, we didn't have genetic testing for BRCA 1 and 2. Those genes had been discovered, but testing wasn't clinically available. And so when it became available, it was amazing. We could take a small blood sample from a patient's arm and learn if they carried a mutation in either of these two major genes, and then really help to change their lives and change the lives of their family members. And after we'd been doing it for a couple of years, our laboratory got a cease and desist letter overnight telling them that those two genes, human genes, were patented and that all testing must cease and desist, not only at our lab, but all over the world. And so I was shocked by this because I didn't know that you could patent a human gene. But what I found was that the people in a position of power said, I'm not getting involved in a lawsuit. I don't want to get involved in a mess. Let's just send it to the laboratory that has the patents. And I found myself being like, no. The laboratory raised the price of the testing overnight from the $1,600 we were charging for it to $2,200. And even though the cost of the technology kept going down, down, down as genetic testing got better and better, they kept raising their prices. And so I was having a hard time getting my patients covered for this test that they really needed. And insurance companies were clamping down as the cost of the testing went up. And so I wanted to fight about it. I wanted to talk about it. I wanted to lecture about it. I was a no-name. I, at this point, was 27. I was writing letters to medical journals trying to get someone to pay attention. And not only were they not paying attention, but I was making a lot of enemies and getting some nasty notes back from some of the journal editors telling me that it was preposterous to not have gene patenting, that that's what innovation is all about, being able to make money off of an invention. But this wasn't an invention. This was patenting the human genes, BRCA 1 and 2. So I continued with my efforts, even as my own national society told me that if I continued to talk about it in our online forum, that I would be asked to leave the society because the company who owned those patents was the biggest employer of genetic counselors in the world at that time. So I made a lot of enemies, but luckily I don't mind enemies. I'm okay with that. So I kept going and kept writing. And then a friend of mine had been watching 60 Minutes and told me that there was a bioethics professor at that time at Penn who felt the same way about gene patents that I did. And so I Googled his name, I found his email address, I wrote to him and said, I've been trying to get a manuscript published. Would you be willing to be a co-author and to read it and give me your thoughts? And he made a few very smart edits throughout the paper. And he said, let me see if I can get it published. And it ended up on the cover of the Journal of Medical Bioethics. And it was distributed around the world. And a few years later, when the ACLU was looking for plaintiffs in the BRCA 1 and 2 lawsuit, they found me. And they came to Yale and asked me to be a plaintiff. It was then I learned that getting involved in a lawsuit of this magnitude actually presents quite a bit of risk to the plaintiff as well as your institution. After going to speak to Yale's general counsel, they were very, very kind to me. They told me that they thought it would be impossible for me to both be a plaintiff in this lawsuit, which at the time also included the US Patent Office, and to continue in my role as the director of cancer genetic counseling at Yale. And I had a moment and I blurted out, would you fire me? I was shocked by this. And so they were kind enough to get me my own attorney pro bono for free. And he helped work out a deal that Ellen Matloff from Branford, Connecticut could be a plaintiff as long as I never mentioned Yale. And the case went on. It went up, up, up. It went to the Supreme Court. And in June of 2013, we learned that in a unanimous ruling that gene patents had been abolished for that purpose. That was my story with gene patenting.
How were you able to just keep riding that wave and trusting your gut when everyone around you was saying, hey, stop?
When I considered being a part of this lawsuit, I checked with some of my closest advisors who I really turned to for advice, and everyone told me that the risk for me was too great for me personally, to be sued by the company, to be bankrupt because I couldn't hire as many attorneys as they could, and that I should drop out of the lawsuit. But during this period in the lawsuit, I went from age 26, 15 years later, fast forward, and I had decided to become a mom on my own. And I have a daughter who's now 14, by the way, but at the time she was a little girl. And the thing that kept me going was I knew that I would never be able to explain to her why I dropped out and why I didn't do something that I knew would be so important for so many other people in the world. And I would never be able to explain that to her as a mom. And so now she's 14 and she talks back to me all the time. She's very sassy. She's 14. But she knows that I was involved in this lawsuit and that I stood up for the things that matter to us. So it was worth it.
What a beautiful lesson. She must be so proud of you.
Not right now, but she will be someday.
She will be.
Right now I'm just embarrassing and annoying.
Yeah, there's nothing you can do about that.
Yeah.
The other thing about that story that I think is really interesting that could resonate with a lot of Breasties is the importance that collaboration had for you, that you were facing this rejection, and it was that moment when you turned to someone else and said, hey, can you help me with this? Can you talk a little bit about that?
One of the things I've learned is that if you reach out to someone really powerful or someone who you think is really powerful and they don't reply to you or they say no thank you, you have lost nothing. And most of the people I've reached out to have not replied to me about a variety of things over time, but I don't care. I will keep asking. And when people reach out to me, as they often do, I try to write them back as often as I can. I can't always do the things they're asking me to do, but I sure do try. Reach out. Reach out to that person who seems too famous, too powerful, too high up. Do it. What do you have to lose? Ask them to help you in whatever it is you need.
And how do you think your expertise as a genetic counselor played a role in the lawsuit? Were you able to draw upon your technical expertise to explain why this matters so much?
Yes. So being a genetic counselor and working with thousands and thousands of families and seeing what happened when people couldn't afford genetic testing or when they couldn't afford all of the genetic testing, because since this company had a patent and they only looked at part of the genes BRCA1 and 2, there were other parts of the genes called large deletions and rearrangements that they weren't looking at. And they wouldn't allow us to look at them and our families who tested BRCA1 and 2 negative through their company, but we knew that they had something because their personal and family histories were so highly suggestive. They wouldn't even let us look at those families. And then when they offered the testing, it was $700 extra out of pocket. And so I watched so many patients walk out of my office without that extra testing who needed that extra testing. And I was able to make this part of my Supreme Court case. I was able to show harm on behalf of my patients and their families.
That's really powerful. Thank you for bringing those stories forward. So, how have you seen genetic counseling, genetic testing change in that time?
Crazy. Ahead of the Supreme Court ruling, which we were favored to lose, I was asked by a lot of reporters what would happen if you won at the Supreme Court, which really seemed more like a dream. And I said that within 3 months of that ruling, the cost of testing would be cut in half, that we would test not only for BRCA 1 and 2, but for dozens of other genes, and that testing would be better. It would include the large rearrangements and deletions. So that was my prediction 3 months from the ruling. But it happened 5 hours later. It happened the same day. And the reason it happened the same day is that all of these laboratories were working in the background to get their products up and running just in case we won the case. And we won the case, and all of that change happened immediately. And so we've seen research surge in this period of time. We've seen new testing methods, DNA, but also RNA, be added to the mix. People who were against this lawsuit said it's going to stifle innovation. It has not stifled innovation at all. Innovation has thrived in this period of time. So it's been huge changes, and there are more ahead of us.
This is just all so exciting, and I'm realizing the time is much further to. Correct me if I'm wrong, but that was also around the time when Angelina Jolie came out with her.
Correct, just a few months before.
So I can imagine the combination of public noise around her positive test results, as well as the Supreme Court case, must have just like
Amped it up.
Yeah.
It amped it up. Just a few months before the Supreme Court case, the actress Angelina Jolie shared her story in a New York Times editorial. And suddenly our phones were ringing off the hook because it made genetic testing really like a household term instead of something just done in a research study that no one had ever heard of. And it wasn't just for breast and ovarian cancer. We saw people coming in for colon cancer and uterine cancer. And to have that followed by the Supreme Court case was just a win-win. And then there was a tsunami of people coming in, wanting testing, wanting genetic counseling. And so that's one of the things that led me to create my company to scale genetic counseling and testing so that it's not only the wealthy and the white who have genetic testing and counseling information, but that it's accessible to anyone diagnosed with cancer or with a family history of cancer.
And from your perspective, why is this information so critical for someone to have, even without a cancer diagnosis?
Having started in genetic counseling before some of these genes were available, let me tell you what we did back in the day. They would sit down with me. I would take their family history by hand on paper in something we call a pedigree. And based on their family history, we would say, it appears that in your family this is hereditary, and based on your placement in the family, we think your chance to carry the gene is 25%. That's all we had. And so people would be making unbelievably big decisions. Should I have my breast removed preventatively? Should I have my ovaries removed preventatively? Not even knowing if they carried a mutation, but just based on that family history and what we sketched out to be their risks. So making the testing available, now we had some concrete data, not only about do you carry a mutation, but what those risks are for you, for your family members. Some people carry it, some people don't carry it. And now we have precision medicines that if you carry a mutation and you have certain kinds of cancers, there are a handful of drugs that might work better for you. And that's where we're moving in the future.